Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lucas Hirsch, and I'm scientific officer at the nccr on the Move, which is the Swiss Center for Migration and Mobility Studies, whose main base is here at the University of Neuchâtel. Together with the History Institute of the University of Neuchâtel and Jordi Tegel's research project on sea and air border formation in the interwar Middle East, we have the pleasure to co-organize today's lecture, which will be given by Alan Lester, who is Professor of Historical Geography at the University of Sussex in the UK. Thank you very much for being with us today. We are delighted to have you, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation on space, place, and mobilities of people, capital, and ideas in the global restructuring of the British Empire. This sounds very appealing. We also have the pleasure to have with us Sarah de Atuglia Filipe, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the nccr on the Move, and whose research interests also include empires and mobility. Sarah has kindly accepted to discuss Alan's paper. And then, if we have time, of course, we will have some questions from you, and maybe also from the many people who are attending online. So, without further delay, I will now give the floor to Alan Lester for the lecture. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you. Thanks for coming as you were here, and thank you to all of you online as well. It's a real pleasure to be here. So what I'm going to talk about today is something that stems from a very long-term project of mine, really, over the last 30 years, which is to analyse the projects that Britain's pursued through empire and in different imperial spaces, and the networks through which they pursued those projects. This lecture in particular stems from my latest monograph, Ruling the World, which focuses on the projects of imperial governance or governmentality. And I wanted to recast that project not so much as something that's pursued in sequence, as something that's pursued through the management of simultaneity. And this is drawing on some of the work of geographer colleagues, and particularly Doreen Massey. The initial prompt for the project came from when I was looking through the Colonial Office's day books. These were records of incoming and outgoing correspondence, day by day. I just took a random date, beginning of January 1838, to get an idea of what was crossing the permanent Under-Secretary of the Colonial Office, James Stephen's, desk on any one working day. And it soon convinced me that imperial governmentality wasn't the way that the vast majority of historians have always written about it. It wasn't taking a colony, let's say New South Wales, hypothetically, and thinking, now, how shall we plan for New South Wales over the next year, 5 years, 10 years? Instead, as many of you who have managerial positions in universities will know, it's a matter of firefighting every day. What's coming in from where? How do we respond to this? And how do we manage simultaneous crises and developments and appeals, petitions and lobbies in the moment at any one time? The space for sequential thinking was actually very small. It did occur, it occurred periodically, it occurred when crises demanded it, but otherwise governmentality was the management of simultaneity, essentially. And that's what I'm hoping to convey by focusing on one particular short segment of time in which the entire British Empire was restructured in the 1830s, and how a conjunction of simultaneous events led to a restructuring of empire, and thinking about the flows of power, the locales of power, the trajectories that combined to reshape empire in that moment. So, over the last decade or so, British imperial historians have invested to a far greater extent in global history. John Darwin and James Belich from Oxford cast the British Empire within longue durée inter-imperial geopolitics and transcontinental economic and demographic flows in their co-edited volume, The Prospect of Global History, which was published nearly 10 years ago, 2016, marking a broader shift towards global history within British imperial history. And the book's contributors ranged across the period between the ancient and the near present, covering China, the Middle East, Europe, North America, but with South America and Africa more on the margins. The book's first section was entitled Conceptual Considerations, and it attempted to encapsulate the approaches to global space and place that a number of subsequent history books have adopted. These conceptual approaches to space and place, as they were delineated in this volume, and I think it serves as a good model for broader historiography, these approaches tend to fall into three broad categories: examining the same historical phenomenon in different places through time, tracing various forms of connection across conventional spatial units, such as regions or countries or even empires, and examining the historic manifestations of globalization, trying to trace global connectivities, the antecedents of them back through time, thus rescuing the term globalization from the present as it was put in the book. The difficulty, of course, is that most large-scale and indeed many micro-histories combine elements of all three of these approaches to space and place in history. Much of the first half of the introduction to the prospect of global history was taken up with typological distinctions between approaches that seem to me to help little in furthering any argument about causation, what actually propels these connections. Some engagement with the work of geographers, I think, could have enriched the basic concepts of space, place, and mobility deployed in this and many subsequent contributions to imperial and global history. One of the most prominent global historians, Jürgen Osterhammel, notes in the book that, quotes, historians are very rarely ambitious and competent originators of big ideas. They look for theoretical inspiration beyond the boundaries of their own turf, end quote. However, it's historical sociology and economics to whom the editors of The Prospect of Global History and other imperial historians have turned. Osterhammel argues, quote, sociology can add rigour and explanatory power to global history, while the latter can add fluidity and source-based problem-solving to sociology, end quote. The editor's suggestion is that, quote, a key essential role for social theory of all kinds in any analysis done by a historian is its focus on the parameters of proper, rigorous comparison. In recent culture war debates, such comparisons have become heavily politicised as commentators debate which empire was better, which was worse, whether transatlantic slavery or so-called Islamic slavery were worse. And Doreen Massey and other geographers' fundamental points about the relativity of space and place seem not to have been taken on board, even in books that emphasise the fluidity of spatial constructs and the ways in which mobilities have always shaped global history. Despite Osterhammel's assertion that, quote, global historians have thoroughly digested the spatial turn, his frustration is that when everything in the world is seen to be moving and flowing, it's difficult to freeze units for analytical purposes, a logical prerequisite of comparison. So the prevailing idea is that one must freeze spatial units and then compare them, one with another. And it's that really that I want to question. Doreen Massey and other geographers' point is precisely that space and place are never frozen. They are dynamically constituted by things in motion. It is trajectories of things that create space and place, that are space and place. The juxtaposed trajectories of these things create places, and so to presume that one can conceive of places as static, sealed off, discrete, for the purposes of comparison, is immediately to invalidate any comparison. Space, as Massey outlines, is, quote, the product of interrelations. It's constituted through interactions, from the immensity of the global to the intimately tiny. Space does not exist prior to entities and their relations. We must abandon the premise of discontinuity, that is, taking as one's starting point an imagination of space as divided up, and rethink difference through connection. The connections don't generally necessarily create sameness, they create difference too. In many historians' problematic view, geographical difference is constituted, this is quoting Massey, through isolation and separation, First, the difference between places exists, and then those different places come into contact. The differences are the consequences of internal characteristics. This problematic view is what Massey describes as an essentialist billiard ball view of place. It's also a tabular conceptualization of space, whereas space is actually an emergent product of relations. With this in mind, I want to turn to the restructuring of the British Empire as a global entity in the 1830s. Historians of the empire have long acknowledged the migration of its centre of gravity broadly from the west to the East Indies between the 1770s and the 1830s. This was the result of the loss of the American colonies, the acquisition of new colonies seized from the French, Dutch and Spanish empires during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and the expansion of East India Company territories in India. This half-century of transition created what Christopher Bailey called the Second British Empire. Along with a new geography came a new constitution. Whereas the First British Empire was based on enslaved labour, mercantilist trade regulation and forced resettlement, the second was supposedly founded in ideas of free labour, free trade and free emigration. The reality was somewhat different, but those were the ideological principles. However, much of the governmental restructuring necessary to complete and maintain this shift from First to Second Empire was actually concentrated in just a few years of intense and accelerated reform between 1833 and 1838. And it's this conjuncture, this moment, that I want to focus on. Within that 5-year period, a newly reformed British Parliament and government instructed the two main offices, bifurcated offices of imperial governance, the Colonial Office, which was headquartered here at the top of Downing Street, neighbouring number 10 Downing Street, but now demolished. It was creaking under the weight of its files by the time this engraving was produced and had to be relocated shortly afterwards. And the East India Company, headquartered in the much more grand premises of Leadenhall Street in the City of London, amidst the financial heart of the city, appropriately as a joint stock company. The British Parliament instructed both of these offices to work together to engender the political, economic and spatial pattern of a new empire within this 5-year concentrated period. In response, the men in these two offices stitched the crown colonies of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and the company-governed territories of India, plus new settler colonies of the Southern Hemisphere, more tightly together within an imperial framework of governance. British stakeholders, already invested in these different spheres of empire and in very different economic activities, were accorded greater facility to mobilise across these disparate components. Despite the intensity and reach of the changes that were concentrated in the mid-1830s, though, they've seldom been analysed holistically. And I think this is a product of imperial historians' rather limited conception of space and place, that one takes a discrete unit of analysis. It may be a crown colony, it may be the crown colonies, it may be India, it may be the East India Company. It doesn't help, too, that the archives are bifurcated, duplicating the bifurcation of the offices of government. So you tend to have British imperial historians either working and extrapolating from India and the India Office archives in the British Library, or you have historians of the Colonial Office Administered Sphere extrapolating from Crown colonies and working in the National Archives in Kew. Historians of Britain have noted the overall effect of the 1832 Reform Act, and this tends to be historians of Britain, not historians of empire, despite all the work that Catherine Hall and other new imperial historians have done to try and stitch together these separate histories. Acts like the 1832 Reform Act are still seen as the preserve of British Ireland-focused historians. So those kinds of historians have noted how the 1832 Reform Act opened governance to representatives of more commercially and industrially minded electors with a preference for free trade. Separately, colonial historians have just begun to track the reorientation of people, capital and interest from the former slaveholding colonies of the Caribbean to Australia and elsewhere around the empire, in the aftermath of the Abolition of Slavery Act in 1833, passed just 1 year after the 1832 Reform Act, and to examine the payment of compensation to former slave owners for the loss of their human property, which began in 1834, 1 year later. Discreetly again, historians of colonial India and the East India Company have charted the transition of the company in these same years simultaneously. As the new reformed Parliament was passing the Abolition of Slavery Act in 1833, the East India Company's directors were obliged by the terms of a new charter to shift their orientation from commerce and focus exclusively on governance and rent extraction as a new stream of income to supplement that from commerce. Historians of the settler colonies, many of them Australian, meanwhile, tend to focus on the influence of Edward Gibbon Wakefield's advocacy of systematic colonisation and emigration from Britain and the peopling of new settler colonies overseas, with the British government's support for that emigration, again at precisely the same time. This was manifested in the South Australia Colonisation Act of 1834. A significant feature of these years of imperial transition emerges more clearly only when we conceive, as Massey does, of space as the dimension of things being, existing at the same time, of simultaneity. Throughout that intense moment of restructuring, the British Parliament was a particular locus of juxtaposed trajectories from the Western Hemisphere, the Eastern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. And it sought to compensate or guarantee a return on existing stakeholders' investments in whichever part of the empire they were located. In doing so, it enabled new trajectories of people and capital that further reconfigured imperial and global space. This reconfiguration had enormous and variegated implications for indigenous and newly colonised peoples around the globe. The Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, developed at University College London, has exposed the British slave owners who received compensation from 1834 to scrutiny. It provides a vital resource for appreciating the extent to which the slavery business underpinned British society immediately prior to this transition. But the guaranteed dividends for East India Company shareholders that were negotiated in Parliament while slave owners' compensation was being agreed is less well known outside the Indian historiography. And this again is because of the balkanisation of most historians' work, their insistence on treating imperial regions and administrative spheres and archives as if they are billiard balls with discrete edges arrayed on the flat surface of space. There are, of course, exceptions, especially associated with the so-called New Imperial History, and particularly Catherine Hoare's work. The new government's safeguarding of stakeholders from the first British Empire during this transition to the second was really what guided parliamentary discussion and debate. This was the critical motivation for the outcomes passed in Parliament at this time. But it's easily overlooked if we examine each billiard ball in isolation or even artificially freeze them for the sake of comparison. So too is the provision of new opportunities for investments of capital, particularly in government-backed Australian colonisation. And I think we need to reconceive of the colonisation of Australia not just as relocating convicts after the loss of the American colonies or competing with France, but as an outgrowth of this reorientation, giving new outlets to British capital and British settlers during this moment of concentrated transition from west to east, but also to south. Both West India planters and East India Company nabobs, the wealthy officials returning from India, were identified with the old corruption of the borough system that the 1832 Reform Act swept away within Britain. Some families lost fortunes that had been invested in the West Indies after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and then of slavery itself in 1834, and following the loss of the East India Company's trading monopoly between Britain and India with its 1813 charter renewal, a period of volatility, share price volatility, saw several of its investors lose out too. Some 300 families owned both enslaved people in the West Indies and company stock in the East Indies and were particularly exposed to this moment of volatility. However, the compensatory mechanisms overseen by the Colonial Office, the Board of Control, which was the government body overseeing the activities of the East India Company, and the Treasury, during this concentrated moment of transition, helped to secure the passage of other slave owners, traders, and shareholders into this second British Empire, by and large with status and wealth intact. They fostered a reorientation of people, investment, and expertise from the former slaveholding colonies of the Caribbean to intensified colonisation of Australia in particular. They brought these places into relation and thereby recreated the space between them and their inhabitants as imperial space and created new trajectories of mobility for individuals too. So now to break down some of these elements of this transition before recombining them again. The passage of the 1832 Reform Act marked the culmination of a sustained campaign by workers demanding parliamentary reform and the extension of the franchise, but it also followed years of vigorous debate among Tory and Whig elites about the extent of electoral representation that it would be necessary to concede in order to ward off more violent revolutionary change of the kind that had taken place elsewhere, especially in France, USA, and, as far as slave owners were concerned, most threateningly and worryingly in Haiti. As Thomas Ertmann notes, however, quotes, when reform did come, it was not as a result solely of a long and continuous build-up of pressure, but rather a further conjunction of developments at home and overseas in 1830 and 1831 specifically. These included deepening economic distress and agrarian unrest, parliamentarians' fear of contagion from the 1830 revolutions in France and Belgium, and recent precedents for overturning seemingly immutable exclusions from power with the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts and Catholic emancipation. Together, these circumstances rendered the idea of a complete reshaping of the previously inviolate House of Commons imaginable and even inevitable in 1831. The new Whig Prime Minister, Earl Grey's declared intention to see through the Reform Bill was far from radical. It was, to quote Grey, to do as much as is necessary to secure to the people a due influence in that great council in which they are more particularly represented, guarding and limiting it at the same time by a prudent care not to disturb too violently by any extensive changes the established principles and practice of the Constitution. The Representation of the People Act was approved by Parliament and received royal assent on the 7th of June, 1832. Over 50 English boroughs lost all of their parliamentary seats as a result, some lost half, and 42 new boroughs were granted members of Parliament, some of them 2 members. The county electorate in England increased by about 1/3, and a uniform borough franchise was introduced based on ownership or occupation of a dwelling worth £10 in annual rent. The overall franchise grew only to a very limited extent, from 3.2% to 4.7% of the total population. But the growth did mark a new momentum behind liberal reformist interests. Although the number of seats controlled by one single landed aristocrat fell from 276 to 41 by 1840, it wasn't simply a matter of owners of land being supplanted by owners of capital. Rather, the new parliament represented the rapid economic changes of the 1830s that intensified landowner diversification into non-agricultural ventures. The first election after the passing of the Act was held in December 1832 and gave Grey's government 483 out of 658 seats in the House of Commons and a clearer mandate to support the interests of propertied electors in commerce and manufacture as well as land. The new Parliament was greatly energised, its pace of legislation remarkable, and its reach far more global than British historians, who usually relate this story, usually appreciate. The parliamentary sessions of 1833 and 1834 were frantic, with Whigs and Tories rallying together against the threat from below, as Peter Mandler puts it, and groping towards the Victorian compromise of moderate liberalism. The almost immediate passage of the Factory Act of 1833, limiting the working hours of children, the new Poor Law of 1834, providing workhouse relief for able-bodied men, and the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835, allowing borough councils to be elected by all adult male taxpayers, are well known to historians of Britain. Historians of the Crown colonies know best about the weakening of the West India interest of slaveholders through the loss of the pocket boroughs and the new support for the Anti-Slavery Society from around 200 of the new MPs elected in 1832. And it was that sudden influx of new anti-slavery MPs from new boroughs which secured the long-awaited passage of the Anti-Slavery Act. At the same time, the new Parliament renewed the East India Company's charter at the price of terminating its remaining commercial monopoly on the trade between India and China across the East Indies, which was mainly in opium and cotton. Preserving the profitability of the opium trade was critical during these deliberations, and as many of you will know, led to two wars, one in the following few years, the other one in the late 1850s, against China when it tried to prohibit more effectively and police the illegal smuggling of opium. As Miles Taylor has shown, the campaign to open up this remaining East India Company monopoly was one of the initial stimuli in mobilising manufacturing opinion in favour of parliamentary reform in the ports and especially in the cotton districts of the northwest from 1829 onwards. So one of the things that few British historians appreciate with their billiard ball image of the British Isles is that the Parliamentary Reform Act was actually propelled by traders who wanted not just to pursue the opium trade with China, but to forcibly open Chinese markets to the new cotton manufacturers of Lancashire and Yorkshire mills too. What was domestic was colonial and vice versa. In Liverpool, the East India Association had supported free trade candidates in 1830 and 1831 who continued to campaign for the right of all British manufacturers to access Chinese markets using whatever merchant companies they liked and not necessarily confining themselves to East India Company ships. Just as the raft of new anti-slavery MPs in 1832 made the difference in finally passing the anti-slavery bill, these free trade supporters' accession to Parliament swung the balance against the East India Company's remaining monopoly. The company was obliged to give up trading altogether, to repay its long-term loans, and to award compensation and pensions to former employees in its trading arm. And again, this dual compensation payment at the very same time, both to slaveholders and to East India Company investors in the trading arm, is often not appreciated. As the secretary to the Board of Control and as the son of an anti-slavery campaigner, Thomas Babington Macaulay went on to become one of our most famous historians, summed up Parliament's role as both the locus and the director of colonial investor trajectories when he wrote to his sister in the midst of the abolitionist and East India Company Charter renewal debates, because these debates were occurring concurrently and sequentially in the House of Commons. People were sitting through both in the same day. He wrote to his sister, the N-word in one hemisphere, the Brahmins, a derogatory term for all Indians, in the other, disturbed my dinner and my sleep with, quote, ain't I a man and a brother? And that, of course, was the famous anti-slavery slogan used to effect the abolition of slavery. So Macaulay is complaining that formerly enslaved people in one hemisphere and Indians in the other are disturbing his sleep with their humanitarian appeals to the British Parliament. In July 1833, Macaulay explained to MPs why the company was being allowed to continue governing India after it had ceased to be a trading concern. So they just wound down the company as a commercial entity. Why were they not abolishing it altogether? A reasonable question to be asked, and was asked, in Parliament. In part, Macaulay confessed, it was because of the lack of any better alternative when parliamentary business was so frantic and the understaffed colonial office was so focused on emancipation in the Caribbean. There simply wasn't the opportunity to create another government of India. The East India Company would have to do. There wasn't time on the parliamentary calendar nor Commons expertise on India to establish a new branch of government that might supplant the company's authority in India. Besides, Macaulay continued, barring the company from its governing and rent-raising function, as well as its commerce, would mean winding it up altogether, which would be infinitely more fraught than it might first appear. It was one thing to compensate creditors and employees of the company's former trading branch, but disentangling the accrued investments behind the entire East India Company edifice in India would be almost impossible. Macaulay explained to Parliament, quote, "The existence of such a body as this gigantic corporation, this political monster of two natures, subject in one hemisphere, subject to the Crown, sovereign in another, its own government in India, had never been contemplated by the legislators or judges of former ages. Winding up such a behemoth with justice to its stockholders, directors and employees would be enough to exercise all the ingenuity of all the lawyers in the kingdom for 20 years. Rather than being dissolved as its commercial activities ceased then, the company transitioned to become the proxy British government of India, yet still returning income to its private shareholders in dividends extracted from the rent charged to its Indian subjects. In June and July 1833, Parliament was preoccupied with the issue of compensation for vested interests then, both in the case of slave owners in the West Indies and shareholders facing the loss of profits in the East. Liberal reform was required of Britain's imperial governance just as much of its governments at home. But in both cases, reform was a prophylactic against more revolutionary change. In the imperial sphere, the interests of some 40,000 slave owners and some 1,700 East India Company shareholders, between them representing a significant proportion of the moderately and extravagantly propertied British families of the time, would be safeguarded as far as possible. By the time the Evangelical Permanent Under Secretary of the Colonial Office, James Stephen, devoted an entire weekend to drafting the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, it was clear that anti-slavery activists would have to concede on certain issues to obtain Parliament's assent. Alongside a further period of apprenticeship for formerly enslaved people, which was designed to keep them bonded to former owners for a further 4 or 6 years, depending on their status, the price of their freedom was government compensation not for the enslaved but for their owners. The rates set by commissioners in London would vary according to the colony and the estimated productivity of the enslaved person. Enslaved people were worth the most in Honduras, where owners were paid £195 per person, and least in the Bahamas, where an enslaved person was deemed worth only £35. The amount required in total for some 800,000 enslaved people was vast. At £20 million, it equated to some 40% of annual Treasury revenue, a sum equivalent to that which was used to bail out the British banks during the 2008 financial crisis. Rather than increasing taxation to pay off the slave owners, the Treasury raised a loan through the issue of new government securities, which were only finally paid off after a circuitous passage of ownership in 2015. While the new Parliament was agreeing to these terms of compensation for slave owners, it was also considering the fate of the East India Company shareholders under the terms of the Charter renewal. Any opposition that shareholders and directors may have mounted to the loss of revenue from trade was swiftly deflected by Macaulay's promise that shareholders would continue to receive an annual dividend of 10.5%, fixed rate. This, he said, was precisely the same dividend which they've been receiving for 40 years and which they have expected to receive permanently. Rather than being derived in part from trade, these dividends would from now on be extracted mainly from the rent paid by the company's Indian subjects in return for the privilege of being governed by it, and from profits from the company-grown opium sold still as a monopoly product to private traders in Calcutta for smuggling into Canton in China. That in turn enabled the importation of tea to Britain, which was the most heavily taxed good and gave the Treasury further revenue. Between 1834 and 1837, the dividends paid to the roughly 2,000 company proprietors continued to amount to over £600,000 per annum. Now I want to turn to a new set of trajectories enabled by all of these discussions and this transfer of vested interest from the First into the Second British Empire with its locale in the newly reformed Parliament in Britain. And that's what's happening in Australia with Australian colonisation. During the 19th century, some 20 million Britons emigrated to the settler colonies and the USA, mainly the USA, one of the world's largest and yet underappreciated diasporas. These years of concurrent restructuring in the western and eastern halves of the empire were critical too to the stimulation of much of this flow into the southern hemisphere. Concurrent with the anti-slavery campaign, the Reverend Thomas Malthus had been warning of British overpopulation for the last 40 years. Famously, he had argued that population growth tends to outpace its means of subsistence. Checks on growth through disease, famine, war, or birth control were only partial remedies. Malthus's concerns had become more pressing in the wake of victory in the Napoleonic War, which threw former servicemen onto an already oversupplied labour market and fuelled agrarian unrest. Malthus's musings had always placed Britain within its imperial context. While believing himself that it would be unjust for Europeans to exterminate indigenous peoples, it was easy to make an association between an overabundance of people in Britain and the acquisition of new territories overseas. During the 1820s, Malthusianism had influenced a number of government-backed emigration schemes. By the time the 1832 Reform Act was passed, Edward Gibbon Wakefield's ideas of systematic colonisation were dominant. Wakefield seized the opportunity of the reformed Parliament to press ahead with plans for the new colony in South Australia and achieve passage of the necessary bill in 1834 as compensatory payments were starting to flow to slave owners through their agents in London. Thomas Elliot was appointed by the Colonial Office to oversee immigration schemes to Australia. His role was to mediate between the Secretary of State for the Colonies and the Australian colonial governors, marrying British emigration imperatives with sponsorship schemes funded by the governor's sale of Aboriginal people's land. It was no easy task, with quite different ideas of the ideal emigrant at sending and receiving ends. Rather than the overspill from British poorhouses, Australian governors wanted, quote, vigorous and efficient labour calculated to elevate the character of our own industrial population. Having tested his capacity to reconcile these demands, by 1838, Elliot was promoted to head the Colonial Land and Emigration Commission. This was one of the most successful agencies of the new state's bureaucracy. It operated across all of the new settler colonies to propel Britons to those colonies. In 1828, only about 4,500 free emigrants had arrived in New South Wales, whose predominantly convict and emancipist population numbered 36,500. By 1840, thanks in no small part to Elliot's coordination, over 50,000 Britons had emigrated to the Australian colonies. Most of them were not the sort of people who benefited from slave owner compensation payments, new trade opportunities, or guaranteed East India Company dividends. However, the land sales that funded their migration and their opportunities for employment in Australia were bolstered by those who were recipients of these various compensation schemes. So finally, I want to come on to the trajectories of some of the people whose movements were propelled by this restructuring. So I'll conclude with three examples of colonists whose trajectories reshaped different parts of the world as they seized the opportunities of imperial and global restructuring in the 1830s. Charles Prinsep, shown on the left, invested in Western Australia from India. Like many other company officials, his father John had utilised London-based agency houses to repatriate a generous salary, and then he invested it through associated agencies in India to develop private ventures under the cover of the company's monopoly. A lot of East India Company officials were doing this, running their own private businesses under the umbrella of the company's authority, to which the company turned a blind eye. Charles's legal practice in Calcutta enabled him to accumulate his own funds to invest in passenger shipping and trading ventures between India, Singapore, and Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania. After the 1833 charter renewal, however, the loss of the company's remaining monopoly on the Indian Ocean and South China Sea trade persuaded investors like Prinsep to diversify their holdings and business interests. He decided to invest in the new Australian colony at Swan River, what's now Western Australia. In 1837, he recruited other British and Indian stakeholders to invest in the Australian Association of Bengal, quote, for the purpose of transferring investments from Calcutta to Australia. He sent a former East India Company soldier and an experienced manager of Indian workers to establish a stud farm in Western Australia that would supply cavalry mounts to the Indian Army and beef for local colonists. Together with 13 Britons, the ship carried, quote, 1 Chinaman and 37 Lascars to work the farm. Prinsep named the estate Belvedere after his house in Calcutta, and it was described by one visitor as, quote, a droll sort of East India establishment. That droll establishment was possible only because in 1834, the colony's governor, James Stirling, had created the opportunity to colonise to the south of Perth by reducing the Noongar people to weakness, as he put it, by inflicting such acts of decisive severity as will appall them as people, in other words, carrying out one of the greatest massacres in Australian history. His troops and colonists had killed Noongar people and permitted the ongoing use of violence, including murder, against other Aboriginal communities resisting this dispossession. Second pair of brothers, Jacob and Joseph Montefiore, became influential vectors of capital, financial expertise and cultural and political influence as they reorientated investments from Britain and the Caribbean to South Australia, New South Wales and New Zealand. Having left Barbados to be educated in England, Jacob acted as the shipping agent and representative of the Rothschild Empire, mercantilist empire, specialising in the purchase of wool and tallow from New South Wales. With the branch run by his brother Joseph in Sydney, the firm was already well established by 1833. In that year, though, Jacob decided to partner in Wakefield's South Australian colonisation scheme. A plaque in the South Australian Library indicates the significance of his decision to become a member of the Colonising Commission's board and invest in its work for the future of the incipient colony. At a farewell dinner, he declared to the South Australian settlers who had welcomed him so heartily that he would happily continue to represent their interests once he returned to Britain. Jacob's brother Joseph's investment in Australian colonisation was of a more personal nature, preempting the settler surge of the 1830s and abandoning his interests as slavery ended in the West Indies. He had already emigrated to New South Wales in 1828, applying for a grant of 5,000 acres and telling the new colonial secretary, quote, I've resided many years in the West Indies and am familiar with its products. My views will be extended to their cultivation should the soil promise a favourable result. And as a group of Australian historians are now showing, it wasn't just a transfer of plantation products and techniques and capital from the West Indies to Australia that was occurring, it was also the transplantation of the techniques of enslaved labour management, not only with Aboriginal people, but with South Sea Islanders, as they were called, as well. I'll cut to the last example, because I'm running out of time. Celia Scott was a woman who reinvested from slave ownership in Tobago to become a pioneer squatter, as she's remembered now, in the Port Phillip district, which is now Victoria. For Celia and her husband Andrew, the compensation that they received for the emancipation of 107 enslaved people that the family owned in Tobago, £4,000 at the time, was quite a significant proportion of the family's assets, and it was probably that which enabled them to emigrate to Australia, quote, with the prospect of advancing the interest of the family, as one of their sons later wrote. The compensation money enabled Celia and her husband to organise and finance their own emigration as a family group, taking 2 indentured labourers along with them and avoiding the need to rely on government sponsorship. Upon their arrival in Melbourne, Andrew took the advice of other Scottish settlers that they'd befriended and headed northward to the Goulburn and Campapsi regions, a copy of the Squatters Act in hand, to claim a station at Mount Buninyong. New Scottish arrivals subsequently surrounded them, including Celia's friend and neighbour Catherine, who had married into the Kirkland family, which owned a sugar refinery in Britain. Sir John Kirkland, Catherine's husband's grandfather, had also received compensation for 34 enslaved people in Jamaica. Celia Scott's sister, Maria Fleming, also invested her share of the family's slave compensation inheritance in Australia, running a station in New South Wales. And in Victoria today, Celia Scott is remembered as, quote, the first and for some time the only white woman in the Buninyong locality. Of course, their enterprise in transferring capital and techniques from the West Indies via London to Australia is written out of the story. So too is the advice that they received from their Scottish neighbour in Victoria, Neil Black, who said that as a new chum, if he was to establish himself, Andrew and others should be prepared to, quote, slaughter natives without remorse. Okay, I'll jump to the conclusion then. If imperial and global historians interested in a holistic understanding of greater entities like empires, in my case the British Empire, are better to comprehend their transition, their restructuring, their eras, their epochs, they need to look beyond discrete components, in Britain's case the West and the East Indies, and the expansion in the Southern Hemisphere, as separate projects to understand separately, but to conceive of them as a sets of multiple trajectories, combining and conflicting to create space and place simultaneously. The restructuring of the British Empire connected and differentiated the world at the same time. Through connection, differentiation was also achieved. Rather than freezing and comparing places as traditional comparative history tends to do, we need a fluid conception of the relationships and mobilities, continually reconstituting these places. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for this fascinating talk, and we can move directly to the discussion by Sarah de Atuvia Filipe. You have the floor.
Thank you, Alan, for such an interesting presentation. It was, I think, very intellectually rich and methodologically demanding, in my opinion. And bear with me because I was trained as an imperial historian, so bear with me, please. It was very nice because at times I felt like I was, and especially because I was also reading a bit the text you generously gave us. At times I felt I was watching Westminster not as a political chamber, as I'm used to see it, but as a global switchboard, let's say, receiving signals from Barbados, Bengal, and Birmingham. And redirecting them, sometimes efficiently, sometimes anxiously, across oceans. And what this lecture achieves, and I would like to emphasize this, because I was engaging a bit with your work, is the culmination of a long-standing argument in your broader body of work. So imperial networks, which I have here and I can circulate. In imperial networks, you argued over 20 years ago already that empire was never a simple metropole projecting outwards, but always a set of relational circuits. Colonization and the origins of humanitarian governance, I also have here, I will also circulate, show that even care and compassion, humanitarianism, when mobilized through empire, could become instruments of rule. And then one I don't have here, but I had in another version, not a printed one, ruling the world made explicit what your presentation today dramatizes a little bit more, that imperial governance was fundamentally about simultaneous management and not sequential control. And I was also reading, and I think it's perhaps your most quietly unsettling book, which is Deny and Disavow. Expose how modern imperial memory rests not on celebration, but on strategic self-exoneration, let's say. So today's lecture sits precisely where these strands converge. Empire as coordination and denial, as mobility and forgetting, as reform and redistribution. And what you have offered is not just an alternative to comparison. I think it is an alternative to how we imagine time in imperial history. So what this lecture also makes unmistakably clear is that reform in the 1830s was not a series of isolated policy decisions, but a coordinated imperial synchronization, let's say. So abolition, company restructuring, and settler expansion, usually treated in separate chapters, appear here as concurrent adjustments within a single system. So reform does not emerge as a moral rupture, but as strategic rerouting. So capital, privilege, and administration shifting from a form rather than simply disappearing. Now, before I say more, I must confess that when I first saw your title, that in the paper was Reforming the British Empire, and here is Restructuring, I registered with some amusement that I at once attempted something similar on a far smaller scale. I called one article that I wrote Redefining the Russian Empire. Same rhythm, different stakes. Mine dealt with the 1860s, post-war moment of imperial reckoning after the Crimean War. But let me assure everyone here, my redefining was far more sedate. Your Westminster is frantically reallocating capital across continents. Mine involved political aristocrats debating liberal imperialism over afternoon tea. Even if, on occasion, the tea table included unexpected characters, such as anarchists like Bakunin. Well, reform comes in many temperaments. While Alan follows ships and legislation, I followed people through upholstery. Aristocrats moving not across oceans, but across positions, from opposition benches to advisory councils, from provincial salons to imperial ministries. So when Alan speaks of trajectories of people, capital, and ideas, I recognize the instinct, even if the movement I follow was less about across oceans than across desks. His actors reshape continents, mine rearranged ministries. But hearing you today, I realize that I have been tracing a quieter species of motion that belongs to the same genus, change enacted not by rupture, but by rerouting. Which brings me to three reflections, or perhaps three questions, prompted by this lecture and by your wider work. So first, your talk settles one of the most familiar narrative habits of in 19th century historiography, the tendency to portray reform as linear, ethical, and sequential. Many standard accounts still trace a familiar rhythm. So abolition leads to compensation, compensation to liberalization, and liberalization to what is often triumphantly labeled constitutional progress. Even when we acknowledge complications, the overall structure often remains one of upward movement. So your narrative of the 1830s suggests a different shape. Reform, as you presented, is not a clean break from past injustice, but a redirection of its material consequences. Slavery ends, yet the capital it produced reappears in Australian land ownership. The East India Company loses its trade monopoly, but its financial privilege continued through guaranteed dividends. So rather than a shift from one era to the next, we see old structures re-emerging in new locations and formats. Modernity, in this sense, appears less as replacement than as relocation. So which leaves me wondering, at what point does reform simply become logistics? And second, in your talk, especially when read alongside Ruling the World, you offer a striking alternative to the well-worn center-periphery model that has shaped much imperial historiography. What emerges is less a picture of metropolitan command than of continual negotiation, a political arena shaped as much by petitions and pressures from Bridgetown, Calcutta, and Sydney as by parliamentary intention. But this perspective becomes even more, let's say, layered when brought into conversation with Denai and Disavow. There you show that empire's operations were accompanied by a parallel set of narrative practices, efforts not only to govern but also to frame, to justify, and to forget. If empire functioned through simultaneity, it was also remembered or made to be remembered selectively. Abolition, for example, could be retained as evidence of moral advancement, while the compensatory redistribution that followed slipped quietly from view. Reform could be celebrated, the consequences of reform could be disaggregated or obscured. And this raises, at least for me, a methodological question as much as a political one. How might we write histories of interconnected governance without inadvertently flattening the very hierarchies that made these connections possible? So if we treat every reform initiative, every economic shift, every policy transfer as part of a single imperial circuitry, do we risk diluting responsibility across so wide a field that no actor appears accountable? On the other hand, if we isolate particular acts of disavowal or denial, do we risk severing them from the structural relationships that enable them to function? Denying disavow indeed suggests one answer to this, that denial itself may be understood as a relational practice, not simply a matter of political choice or moral failure, which prompts another question for me. Where does refusal fit into a model built around mobility and connection? Can resistance, whether from enslaved people, indigenous communities, or dissenting officials, be written as part of simultaneity, or does it necessarily fall outside the frame? And does dissent travel along the same circuits, or does it interrupt them? And third and finally, thank you for bearing with me. Third and finally, I want to take up your invitation to rethink periodization. You have shown us how 1833 to around 1838 can be read not as a chain of individual policy interventions, but as a single imperial present, a thick temporal knot, in which decisions concerning emancipation, trade, and resettlement overlapped rather than followed one another. And reform here is not a sequence, but convergence. And this suggests a wider methodological possibility. Rather than writing imperial history as chronology by region, we might experiment with moment by consequence. So could, for example, 1857, 1919, or 1947 be approached not as events belonging to one territory, India in revolt or mutiny in the original sources, British sources, India in mourning or India partitioned, but as imperial time crisis registered simultaneously in multiple sites, even if in different registers, like, for example, 1857, whether terms mutiny, uprising, or First War of Independence, is often treated as a strictly Indian episode. Yet, in your framework, it could instead be read as a moment that demanded reaction across the imperial apparatus, reshaping military, legal, and administrative thinking far beyond the subcontinent. Likewise, 1919, from Amritsar to Cairo, or 1947, from Delhi to London, might be written not as local ruptures, but as moments of enforced synchronization, when empire had to recalibrate across vast distances at once. And this is not simply an empirical reframing, it is a methodological one. So comparative history tends to begin by placing cases side by side. But your work invites something slightly different, not synthesis, which risks flattening distinction, but synchrony, asking not how did empires differ, but what happened when they had to respond at the same moment. Not contrast here, but co-temporality, let's say. So let me just close by returning to one of your more, or what I found one of your more subdued lines in the paper that you shared. These movements and flows are the very stuff of imperial and global history. Well, they are, and here I lean gently on denying disavow. They are also the stuff of imperial forgetting. So motion connects, but motion also obscures. If we write flow without friction, we risk becoming basically geographers of alibi, perhaps. So perhaps our task, following your lead, is to write simultaneity with a symmetry intact, to track motion but also blockage, to map circuits but also refusals, and to altogether coordination and denial management and dissent, which of course requires that very unfashionable resource nowadays, nuance. Your lecture compels us to think of empire not solely as geography, but also as choreography, and of history not as progress, but as a movement under pressure. It leaves me more convinced than ever that empires do not simply expand or decline, they reroute. And rerouting, as we know, is rarely accidental, and one of empire's few truly renewable energies. So I thank you all for your patience, and I will open the floor to some questions.
I'll just give a quick response.
Yes.
I won't answer the question.
Sure.
I've never had my work subjected to such rigorous analytical scrutiny, and I thought it was brilliant. Can I have the text? There's so much there that makes me, think about what it is I'm doing, which you don't necessarily explicitly do when you're doing it. But yeah, I mean, I've written down some potential answers, but we'll come back to that later, maybe. Thank you.
Questions?
Somebody else.
Yeah, we might take a few in the room, and then I'll move to the ones online. So, yes, 1, 2, 3 already.
I mean, thanks to both. I thought your commentary was totally brilliant, and actually, I'm going to pick up in a broader sense some of the things you said. Yes, for me, actually, temporality and spatiality have been your, the simultaneity, but also the idea of space and place and the trajectories of things creating place, right? So you've kind of obviously followed that. What about, though, and agency is the issue here as well. I mean, the responsibility you were kind of the politics of writing and the kind of responsibility that agency here it's actually very important, but also scale, because in some ways you could do an analysis of the ways in which empires redeploy a certain type of resources, materials, and whatever, not necessarily to the motherland, but somewhere else, as this is the case. But, I mean, there can be different analytical scales, right? So, I mean, you could, for instance, look at it from the perspective of a smaller administrator, the desk of a smaller, lower administrator in the colonial office or elsewhere, with the balanced perspective of indigenous communities as response. Do you understand what I mean? I mean, I'm wondering, and also there is this other thing in global history, right? I mean, of course, because they had to deal with globalization a lot and reconceptualize and re-historicize, but it's all about movement, right? So what about things that don't move? I mean, friction is one of the kind of in the story. I mean, they're just very general ideas, but.
Yeah, thanks. Should I do one at a time? Or?
What do you prefer, to collect?
Yeah, maybe, because otherwise I'll forget.
Two other questions here and over there.
Go ahead if you want to.
Yeah, is it okay to do one at a time?
One at a time, sorry. Yeah.
No, thanks. Just to keep it relatively brief, that lecture was evacuated of resistance effectively, just to try and sort of squeeze everything in. But in the books, hopefully the resistance, both necessitating and propelling and stymieing these redirections should come through. Just to give one example, in ruling the world, I took sort of 3 snapshot years of the empire, one of which was 1857. And the whole point, as you were alluding to, Sarah, was that in 1857, the empire was faced by such a massive act of resistance with the uprising in India that it propelled another restructuring, not just with the pulling of troops from all the crown colonies to India and the ludicrous passage of British soldiers across the Isthmus of Suez dressed as civilian tourists so that they wouldn't upset the Egyptian locals too much. There's frantic negotiation between the Foreign Office, the Pasha, and Constantinople about how to get British troops across the Isthmus quickly to put down the uprising in India. Compromise was, okay, they can go through, but they mustn't look like soldiers. So you had railway carriages absolutely packed with mustachioed, strapping British men carrying rifles in fishing rod packs and things like this. But anyway, that was a bit farcical. But that's just one example of spectacular large-scale resistance that prompts this kind of reorientation. There's also the more mundane, everyday acts of resistance that are continually leading to the adaptation and the reformulation of imperial projects and the demise of imperial projects. The things that don't move, to come quickly onto that, I mean, slightly facetious, but not really. Doreen Massey addresses this in this idea of trajectories with the answer that everything moves. Mountains are in a process of movement, rivers are in a process of movement. It's just that they may take geological timescales rather than the timescale of a lifespan. But everything is in motion. But to all intents and purposes, you say certain things are static. And they produce diversions, deflections in these trajectories and also blockages of some of them. So thinking of connectivity producing both continually reproducing difference doesn't necessarily mean that you're thinking of a homogeneous plane across which these things operate. One has to take terrain and obstacles, both human and physical and natural, into account in the more complicated mapping of these trajectories, basically, I think.
So thank you again to both of you. I really appreciated the sort of expansion temporally and geographically from most of what the rest of what we've been talking about, which is the late 19th, early 20th century Middle East. But one thing maybe that has also come up multiple times over today has been sort of the role of corporations or of corporate history more broadly in administering or causing friction to imperial rule. So I wondered, and you addressed this Alex, sort of in the beginning of the presentation, but I wondered if you could maybe speak more about how we can think about corporate or histories of corporations or companies in the work we do, sort of connected to some of the other things we've been talking about, from oil companies and transport companies, etc. And as someone who works on Iraq in the early 20th century, I can appreciate your point about the division between the India office and the colonial office. Requires a lot of cross-London trips to India. The India office obviously was administering, was overseeing the invasion during the Mesopotamia campaign, and then after the war it gets sort of shunted off to the colonial office. So I appreciated your recognition of some of the difficulties between
just to pick up on that first, these cross-London trips. Going back to what I was saying about 1857 and how it prompted a restructuring, the archival trips today in a way mirror the problems of imperial governance that were highlighted and became a crisis to sort out because of the resistance in India, because you had East India Company messengers running 2 miles from Leadenhall Street in the city to Whitehall to deliver messages saying, which Indian troops do you want us to mobilise? We need these horses from the War Office delivered here. Then you'd have messengers in Whitehall running from the Colonial Office to the War Office and the Army Office headquarters. And it proved such a nightmare just trying to coordinate these 2 offices in governance that one of the outcomes of 1857 was that the new Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as it is today, building purposely planned to bring together the India Office. Obviously the East India Company was no more in charge, but the India Office, the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office all around one quadrangle with these tubes through which messages could be sent to communicate with one another. But the poor historian is still left to leg it across London between the 2 archives. In terms of corporations, and Philip Stern has produced this account of empire through corporations, and I think he's onto something that is incredibly important to think, particularly about joint stock companies and their role, which of course the East India Company was, as vectors of early empire, but they are also most powerful when there's a convergence of interest with other imperial actors. In the first instance, things like the Irish plantations, the Ulster plantations, the merchant investors from London are working very closely with the monarchy, and obviously even the East India Company, the Virginia Company, the Royal African Company involved in the Atlantic world can do what they do because they get a charter from the Crown. It's the granting of that charter that makes the East India Company the sovereign power of 2/3 of the empire for a long period. So it's that commercial activity, and it's a two-way street. In return for power and sovereignty, which the Crown can grant, these companies are extending credit to the government, to the Crown and to the British government. And it's only through that extension of joint stock company credit, particularly the South Sea Company, through the 18th century that enables the British fiscal military state to win the various wars against rival European powers and to emerge triumphant after 1815 with domination effectively of the seas. So that kind of hand-in-hand relationship between state power and corporate credit and territorial power is absolutely integral throughout. And as we've heard this morning, there's that kind of allure, that promise of a revival of that kind of relationship in the mandates with oil companies, just as the empire seems to be on its last legs during the First World War, and hence that kind of imperial hubris that I was mentioning earlier.
Thank you. I think David had a question.
I'll be brief. I think it's the second movable empire we've discussed today, which I love as a concept, as kind of to think when and how empires move, and what triggers them and what actually gets moved. My question is basically based on the people who you bring in the paper itself, and I was kind of trying to figure out if they're settlers or they're investors, and I kind of bunched them up in my head as people who profit off of empire, who the fruits of empire flow to their pockets. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, if there is a qualitative difference between settlers, which to my mind are people who profit off of empire but also live in the colonies and move physically in their houses, and people who are, I guess all of the British elite were invested in the joint stock companies and they profited off of, you know, the East India Trading Company and all these things. And finally, just about the movement, the terminology I think does matter in the terms of like, I know of like the recent monographs on British Empire kind of insist on trouble and duress and words that kind of invoke friction and disharmony, because the terms that we used to use like in terms of movements and flows and things kind of suggest other things like very.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it does relate to a lot of what we were discussing this morning as well, that this distinction between investor and settler. I think broadening out from that, but including it, one needs to think about any vectors of movement, not just as a kind of linear connection between point of origin and point of destination, but about the multiply located enablers of that trajectory. And in this case, it's settlers who move. Some of those are also investors. The majority aren't. In the case of this sort of 20 million British diaspora, most of them are not capitalists. They don't have reserves of capital to invest. They seek to accumulate capital by acquiring land. That's their key motivation. But their movement from Britain to South Australia or even to the USA is enabled by investors who are relocating their capital. So the Montefiore brothers, for example, are investors in different parts of the empire, and they move around the empire, they dwell in different parts of the empire, but ultimately London is the nexus of their investment, the reservoir of their capital, effectively. And it can be multiplied, and it has been multiplied in the Caribbean through slave ownership. It can be multiplied through investment in India, and it can be redirected, propelling settlers along with it to Australia. So in their case, what they do is use that capital that has been generated in multiple sites around the empire to establish credit facilities, the bank in South Australia, to prop up the new South Australian colonial government with credit, and to extend that credit so that the settlers, arriving without much capital, can borrow to buy seeds, tools, equipment, and ultimately quit rent for their new land. So I think it's good to think about any particular vector as multiply located in that way.
Thank you. I think we might try to take one online question. There is somebody who has listened for a long time, so I will try to, I hope this will work. So, activate the microphone. It's been too long, the computer has shut down, so I don't think this will be possible. Unfortunately. Last attempt. Sorry, I don't think this is working.
Well, in the meantime, then
Yes.
I may have a question.
You do, and
So I'm not sure. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I was captivated by what you were saying, but I'm not entirely sure that I understood everything. It seems one thing that I seem to like is that you haven't given up on causality, right? I mean, everything happens in interconnected, complex. There is a feedback effect, whatever you name it. But fundamentally, there is a cause, and there are consequences. They may be complex, but they do exist, right? That relationship exists, and in your case, if I simplify it perhaps excessively, it really starts from a fairly seemingly benign reform of the franchise in the UK, with a very modest, limited expansion of the electorate, that then produces a brand new coalition or vast support for the Abolition Act, and also something that is probably, that hasn't changed much, which is a pro-capital kind of parliament, right? And these triggered, this is the original sin in some ways. I mean, there is no such thing as a sin here, but this is the root cause, right? The change in parliament. And I'd like us to tell us a bit more about that reform that seems to be so modest. I mean, you know, I've seen it in history books and I've read some of the parliamentary debates preceding it, but I had no idea that it was so modest, basically. So how come such a modest bill can produce such renew so profoundly, seemingly at least, and according to what I understood from what you said, the elites in Westminster, and as a result have such profound changes, global changes, or at least throughout the empire?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, broadly, I think that simplification works. The only kind of proviso I would add is that act of reform in Parliament itself shouldn't be seen as a kind of an originally singular point, because it too has been caused multiply by various circumstances. But in terms of why that a change in parliamentary representation becomes so decisive, it's partly because of the way that Westminster Parliament works, that a change in a few seats can tip a party or a group, at this point, a coalition, into a majority, and thereby enable legislation that hadn't been enabled or had been blocked or delayed previously. So although the composition of the electorate as a whole hasn't changed much, the composition within Parliament of its representatives has changed quite significantly in terms of what interests they want to pursue and how they're going to pursue them. It's not a total and convulsive change, because some of these tendencies are already underway. Adam Smith, for instance, has been critiquing mercantilism and promoting free trade since the 1760s. It takes other events for his ideas to become more acceptable, particularly the American Revolution and the loss of the American colonies means that much of the control over trade in the Atlantic that had been exercised under mercantilism is now questioned much more. You've got the growth of industrial capacity, the Industrial Revolution effectively, itself propelled by the transatlantic slave plantation complex and the capital that's coming in and being invested in specific regions of industrialisation. That's creating a new lobby of merchants and industrialists who are kind of banging at the doors of power all the way up to 1832. Right. So you've got.
So they were challenging the kind of landed elites, irrespective of the reform, right?
Yeah,
just
that's right.
Kind of facilitated their presence in parliament.
Exactly. Yeah. So you've got that kind of aristocratic stranglehold on power being challenged by new commercial and industrial orientated elites. You've got the government's former reliance on mercantilist trade restrictions being challenged, which is a convergence again of interest with those new elites who want access to markets. You know, the East India Company, for instance, controls. They don't want to have to use just British ships when they're in the Caribbean. They want to use whatever ships are available, etc. So all of these things are converging. But you're right that parliamentary reform, when it comes, propels all sorts of changes that were unanticipated at the time, and which this slight shift in representation enables, kind of unlocks. So it's not as if new things are being invented, it's that interests that are there before, suddenly their potential is unlocked and they are able to be realised.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes,
Just
because
to follow up on that.
I'm not managing to
was
put the online question, so please go ahead.
Okay.
This might be the last
whether
question.
there's a Whig government in power or a Tory government. When Disraeli comes into power, does anything change, or is it all just this actor network theory where nobody's in charge?
No, it makes a difference. And you know, this kind of multi-scalar, I didn't answer the question about scale, that reminds me earlier, but this kind of multi-scalar approach is infinite. One can bring it down to the parliamentary politics, or you know, in your case to the tea salon, and look at the power dynamics within each of these. So within the British Parliament, it makes a difference whether Gladstone, Liberal, later on Liberal, or Disraeli, Conservative, is in power. And it also makes a difference, even regardless of who is in power, the politics that's being mobilised within Westminster, the parliamentary party politics, makes a huge difference. So, you know, this morning we heard about the British humanitarian interest in the Bulgarian atrocities and intervention into Ottoman space by the British, and then later on with reference to Armenian massacres too. Much of that motivation for the British Empire to act and to be seen as the guarantor of refugee safety and the saviour of the Bulgarians and the Armenians, much of that comes from the inter-party politics within Westminster. It's Gladstone mobilising Disraeli support for an oppressive Ottoman Empire and saying, look, Britain should be better than this. Give us parliamentary power and we'll enact humanitarian intervention. We'll make the Ottomans behave themselves. And you know, this is purely about Gladstone versus Disraeli. It's not really about what's going on in the Ottoman Empire, but it's opportunistic parliamentary politics. But it can have real repercussions, even if it's not primarily motivated. It has real effects when that humanitarian intervention is brought to bear. So who's in power and the politics within Westminster is important, because in unpredictable ways it fires off these consequences, these causes and effects elsewhere. But just to come back to the scale thing, I think geographers are increasingly thinking about scale as well as space and place as social constructs, and particularly as constructs of governmentality. I was just thinking of the example of India, that within the governmental apparatus of the East India Company, local officials think of scale as their municipality, their area. You've got the presidency officials who think of the Bombay presidency or the Madras presidency or the Bengal presidency as a particular scale. And it's only really in London, Leadenhall Street, that India is conceived as an operable and instrumental and meaningful scale of analysis, well before the Indian state obviously emerges. So, you know, scale is socially and politically and governmentally constructed constantly and reconstructed constantly, I think.
But I guess I meant more methodologically for you, your
Yeah.
choice of the network, the nodes of the network.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that was a really good point. In this instance, it is driven by the desire to understand where and what particular conjunction of trajectories power, these consequences, these cause and effect gets generated. And, you know, as I say, it could be a potentially infinite exercise, but there are locales of disproportionate power, let's put it that way. There are locales and moments, and both have to be taken into account, not just the moment, not just the temporality, but the spatiality too, as concentrated bursts of power.
The person who was online has written the question. I will just read it, and I think then we will stop there. Sorry for not being able to activate the microphone. But so Hilaire, Kevin and Zuzi is asking, when you compare the colonial politic between France and UK, what was exactly or particularly the force of the British Empire? And also why the British Empire did not establish empire in South America?
Right, God. Big questions. I don't know if I can be able to do more than much justice to them. So French and British empires in South America. Let me do South America first. There's a traditional school of British imperial history associated with Robinson and Gallagher, which talks about informal empire being the preferred mode, and formal empire only being a resort that local officials would drag the empire into if the British couldn't achieve their various objectives through informal control. Basically because informal control is cheaper. You know, you don't have to go to the expense of establishing a governmental apparatus, military occupation, etc. Broadly, the answer, I think, is that much of South America, as it became independent from Portuguese and then Spanish rule in the 1820s, from the 1820s, British investors could find, and the British military actually, could find that the objectives that they were pursuing could be pursued without invading and taking over these newly independent emerging countries, largely through finance, with the extension of loans, through investments, but with the backup of force, classic gunboat diplomacy. So if these new South American, Central American states didn't do what was in Britain's interest, Britain would threaten them with shelling their ports via Royal Navy ships. So by and large, those Britons who were interested in South America got what they wanted without colonising, to make it very simple and very quick. A similar kind of answer, I guess, with British and French empires. We heard a lot this morning, which is fascinating, about the kind of choreography, the dance between these two empires, sometimes rivals, occasionally confronting one another. I'm dealing here largely with the post-Napoleonic period, by which time both empires are slightly more settled rather than directly fighting all the time for control of the Atlantic world and the Indian Ocean world, as they had been through the 18th century. But by the 19th century, kind of wary potential allies and potential combatants, and it's in this area of informal empire, and when they butt up against other empires like the Ottoman Empire, that this dance between the two becomes particularly intriguing. And when Jordi was talking earlier about this sort of collaboration over airways in former Ottoman space, I was thinking of a previous episode in which the British and French had a convergence of interest and decided to work alongside each other. And that was China and the Second Opium War, which was a war led very much by Britain, but tacitly supported by the USA and actively supported by the French. It was a joint British Anglo-French expeditionary force that was sent to defeat the Qing Empire in China and to enforce the opening of more treaty ports, enforce the opening of Chinese markets to both British and French manufacturing and trading interests, and to secure extraterritorial rights for both British and French subjects on Chinese soil. So here you have a real instance of alignment, convergence of inter-imperial interest at the expense of another empire, the waning Qing Empire. But it's contingent. There's no fixed relationship between the two empires.
Thank you. I think we will put an end to this fascinating talk. Thank you again very much for the presentation and also for the discussion. I think we can give another round of applause.